Hi, I'm Ellie Everts, and since the beginning of this year, I have been working on an Edwardian-inspired version of Sophie Hatter from Howl's Moving Castle. Well, my friends, it is finally time to finish this costume, and I am so excited to show you all the finished product. It turned out beautiful, and I think you guys will really like it. If you've been following my channel or my Instagram, you might know that I have made every single layer of this costume. Everything from the combination, which is the bottommost undergarment, through the corset and the petticoats and the corset cover. The whole 9 yards has been handmade by me following historical methods. So it's really exciting to see this costume finally come together. Today we are going to be making the bodice, which is going to be super cute, very fluffy, and feature gorgeous bishop sleeves. So if you guys are all ready, let's go ahead and get started. Let's take a look at the pattern pieces needed to create Sophie's bodice. I'm using the same pattern that I used for my 1905 combination. However, I have removed the shoulder seam and I have taken the front piece and turned it into a big rectangle that's going to be gathered to create the volume on the front of Sophie's bodice. After I have cut my pieces from both linen and cotton and then flatlined them together, I am going to go ahead and create a button placket at the front of my bodice. I am using my clear ruler as a guide and turning over the material by 1 inch. Once this is pressed into place, I'm turning it over again and pressing it once more. Now I can go ahead and top stitch this placket down. Having this many layers of material is going to create a great base for our buttonholes. Before we can add our buttonholes, I am going to stitch together my 2 back pieces. I'm lining these pieces up at center back and stitching them together with a straight stitch. Once this has been stitched into place, I'm going to press the seam flat, and then I am going to trim all but one of my seam allowances, using this last seam allowance to fold over and create a beautiful finished edge. This is a flat felled seam. It's the same type of seam that I used on the rest of my Sophie costume. I am now going to finish this seam by stitching the seam allowance by hand onto the lining of the bodice. This creates an absolutely beautiful effect, and I loved using these flat felled seams on my entire costume. Next, we are going to create the collar. I have cut 2 copies of my collar pattern and have lightly interfaced them. Next, we are going to be stitching these together, but I'm going to be inserting this adorable lace between the 2 pieces. Once this is pinned into place, go ahead and stitch it with a straight stitch. Once stitched, we need to clip into the curves of our collar. This way, it'll lay nice and flat. Now that it's been snipped, go ahead, turn it inside out and press it flat. Now comes the scary part, attaching the collar to the bodice. Now, to be honest, I always struggle with this part. It doesn't matter how many times I have made or attached collars, I always mess it up. I'm going to mark the seam allowance on my collar with a sewing pencil, and then I'm going to match up the center back of my collar with the center back of my bodice. Once these have been matched up, I'm going to pin as much as I see fit, and then stitch these pieces together. Now, to make sure that I got this right before I trimmed any seam allowance or finished anything off, I went ahead and put this onto my dress form. Luckily, it turned out perfect on the first try. I guess that's what happens when you use a commercial collar pattern. They kind of work, I guess. Now, to finish off this seam, I trimmed off the extra seam allowance on all but one of my edges, and then folded the other edge over to create a beautiful seam that I stitched by hand. Now with our collar attached, we can talk about buttonholes. Now, first off, let me just say that this piece looks really cool when it's laid flat with a collar. Like, look how nice that looks. I made these adorable little buttons using a fabric-covered button kit that I got at Joann's, and now I'm going to be marking out my buttonholes. Once the buttonhole places have been marked, I'm going to stitch them with my sewing machine. Now that the back and collar of our bodice is nice and ready, we can go ahead and attach the front piece. Now, like I mentioned, this is a large rectangle that is going to be gathered to create the volume on the front of Sophie's bodice. So I'm going to run a basting stitch on both my linen layer and my cotton layer. And that's right, this is the only piece that was not flat lined. We are going to be using this piece to line the front and keep all of those seams nice and pretty. So we are going to keep these two pieces separate until it's time to connect them. Once we've run the basting stitch along the top of our linen layer, I'm going to go ahead and gather it onto my collar piece. Once that's pinned into place, I went ahead and stitched it with a straight stitch. And now we are going to repeat this process with the cotton layer, sandwiching the collar in between the linen and cotton layer of our front bodice. This is going to not only hide that seam, but it's also going to give us a little bit of extra volume and lift along this ruffle. Once the lining was stitched into place, I trimmed off my seam allowance and then I understitched my seam allowance onto the lining layer. This is going to keep everything in place and make sure it's not flopping around. Once this was finished, I stitched the side seams together with a straight stitch and then flat felled the seams just like I have all the others. Now we can move on to the sleeve. I'm using a 2-part sleeve pattern that I drafted from the American System of Dressmaking. This sleeve pattern has been greatly altered to allow for bishop sleeves. Bishop sleeves are kind of poofy at the shoulder, fitted throughout the sleeve, and then super poofy at the wrist. I think that this is an adorable sleeve type and was very common in the 1905 era, so this is perfect for my Sophie project. I started by connecting the outer seam of the sleeve using a French seam. This means that I stitched it once, trimmed the seam allowance, flipped it inside out, and stitched it again. Once the outside seam was finished, I stitched together the inner seam with a straight stitch, leaving about 4 inches open at the bottom, and then felled over these seam allowances. I had to be extra particular with this stitch. As you can see, the sleeves are not lined, so as I was felling these seams, I was very careful to only grab 1 or 2 threads of my linen at a time. Once the seams of my sleeve were finished, it was time to attach the cuffs. I made these cuffs just like I would a skirt waistband, with 5 inches of material interfaced and then turned over twice to create a beautiful waistband. I first gathered my sleeve to my cuff, then I pressed everything into place and stitched in the ditch. Next, it's time to attach our sleeves to our bodice. With 2-part sleeves, it's very important that you put the right sleeve into the correct arm. Otherwise, your sleeve is going to end up facing the other direction and your bodice is going to be very uncomfortable. So I pinned these sleeves into place very carefully and then stitched them down. Once the sleeves were stitched into place, I once again trimmed most of my seam allowance, then turned the long edge over and hand stitched this into place. I wouldn't really call this a flat felled seam, but it does look very nice anyway and is keeping everything nice and tidy inside the bodice. All that's left on the sleeves is to add a couple buttonholes onto each of the cuffs and then finish them off with these beautiful gold buttons. Now, in the film, Sophie doesn't have buttons on her cuffs, and if she did, I'm pretty sure that they would be the same aqua color as the buttons along her neck. However, I really love the look of these golden buttons, and frankly, if I would have had one more, I would have replaced the buttons on the neck as well with these golden buttons. Now, all that's left is to finish off the hem of our bodice. To finish the bottom of my bodice, I'm going to be basically making a waistband. I started by creating a 4-inch wide strip of my linen that I made a circle of the same width as the bottom of my bodice. I stitched this into place and then folded it over. I folded this over twice, just like you would for a waistband, but before I stitched it in the ditch, I went ahead and cut a piece of pink satin ribbon, and I stitched the center back of my ribbon to the center back of my bodice. This is going to keep it into place so it doesn't fall out or get all topsy-turvy. After that, I am going to thread the pink ribbon through my entire waistband and have it pop out through 2 buttonholes at the front of my waistband. Once this is all situated, we can go ahead and stitch in the ditch. And with that, our bodice is finished. All right, guys, well, here is a look at my finished Sophie costume. I think it came out super adorable. The first time I wore it, I wasn't thrilled with the silhouette, but I think that's just because Edwardian silhouettes aren't really something I'm used to. It's not a look that I wear every day. So to me, seeing such an exaggerated bust line was like, ooh, what is going on? But this is my second time wearing the full thing all together, and I think I like it quite a bit more. I'm still not sold on the wig. I think I'll get a different one should I wear this costume more frequently. This is actually my Bella wig with clip-in bangs, so not maybe the best method for this, but I do think it's really, really cute. I think the sleeves are one of my favorite details. Look at those, they're so poofy. It's a 2-part sleeve pattern, as you guys saw. I've never done 2-part sleeves before, so that was a challenge. I definitely set one of these sleeves wrong like 3 times and then I had to redo it. Very frustrating. But in the end, I think it was worth it because they look adorable and the gold buttons was a good choice. Anyway, I hope you enjoyed watching me make an Edwardian outfit. Now, don't think that this channel has become historical costuming. It has not. It is cosplay 100%, just with a few historical details thrown in there. So I hope you enjoyed. It's a bit different than what we normally do, but I think it was fun. I hope you guys agree. Anyway, I've also made a video showing how I get ready in this costume. It's kind of aesthetic and kind of pretty. I filmed it with this beautiful golden lighting. I mean, look at this. Ooh, it's so pretty. So please look forward to that. I'll make sure to put a link above when it's released. If you have any questions about this costume, parts that were confusing, parts that you want to know more about, let me know in the comments or you can shoot me a DM on Instagram. I'm kind of slow to respond, but I promise that I read all of them and I try to respond to almost everything. Of course, thank you guys for watching and thanks for your support. Really, really appreciate it, more than you guys might know. And I hope to see you next time. Until then, be sure to keep sewing, stay positive, and have fun. I will see you later.